Most real-world tastes don't fall into the extreme categories of perfect substitutes, as in graph 5.1, or perfect complements as in graph 5.2. Most cases lie somewhere in between, where individuals are willing to substitute the goods somewhat for one another, but not perfectly. We'll give some examples here. Our first indifference map contains indifference curves that are almost straight parallel lines, but not quite. We've built in a little bit of curvature into these curves. That is to say, each indifference curve becomes just a little bit shallower as we move along the indifference curve downward. A consumer with tastes like this is therefore willing to change somewhat the rate at which she is trading the two goods, depending on how many of each she has. Thus, her tastes exhibit diminishing marginal rates of substitution, but barely so. We would say that tastes like this exhibit a relatively high degree of substitutability without representing tastes for perfect substitutes. Now imagine taking each of the indifference curves in panel A at their ends and bending them a little bit so as to increase the degree of curvature that's built into them. We then get an indifference map that looks a lot like that in panel B. Notice that we've now moved further away from the extreme case of perfect substitutes and closer to the extreme case of perfect complements without getting all the way there. A consumer with tastes represented by the indifference map in panel B would be one that views the goods as more complementary and less substitutable than the consumer whose tastes are graphed in panel A. Of course, we could imagine bending those indifference curves even further and getting an indifference map that looks like that in panel C. Now we're even closer to the case of perfect complements, but still aren't quite there. Still, we can say that a consumer whose tastes are represented by the indifference map in panel C views these goods as relatively more complementary and less substitutable than the consumer whose tastes are graphed in B or the consumer whose tastes are graphed in A. One important feature of taste is therefore the degree to which individuals are willing to substitute goods for one another. And the place where we see this degree of substitutability is in the shape of indifference curves. If those shapes are close to those of perfect substitutes, then the consumer is quite willing to substitute the goods for one another. If, on the other hand, the indifference curve looks closer to that of perfect complements, the consumer is not as willing to substitute the two goods for one another. We would say one exhibits a high degree of substitutability, whereas the other exhibits a low degree of substitutability. And by moving an indifference map from that of perfect substitutes slowly all the way to that of perfect complements as we've done in this graph, we get a sense of how to read an indifference map in terms of how willing the individuals whose tastes are represented by that indifference map are to substitute the goods for one another. This will become important in Chapter 7 when we begin to talk about what we'll call substitution effects.